good day everyone. We are Group 4. Today we will discuss about industrial hygiene and hazard communication and chemical safety. So the contents of our discussion is first industrial hygiene. So let's talk about industrial hygiene. So the definition of industrial hygiene is that next slide please. It deals with the process of identifying, evaluating, and controlling potential workplace environmental hazards that happen, which can cause things such as sickness, impaired health, and well-being or discomfort to workers and the community. So it is all about keeping workplace safe and healthy for employees. It involves identifying and controlling hazards such as chemical, noise, and ergonomic risk to prevent illness, injuries, and other health problems among workers. So yung tawag dun sa mga tao na nagdi-deal sa industrial hygiene are industrial hygienists. So they are trained to anticipate, recognize, evaluate, and recommend controls for environmental and physical hazards that can affect the health and well-being of workers. So next naman is the importance of industrial hygiene. So one of the importance of industrial hygiene is that in the workplace, following good occupational hygiene practices benefits both employees and the industries. Meeting occupational health and safety standards leads to enhanced worker health and well-being. It also decreases the chances of employees having to leave employment due to injury or illness. So basically, ang importance nitong industrial hygiene is that if clean yung workplace ng mga workers, mas high yung chance na I mean mas less yung chance na magkaroon sila ng injuries or other illnesses na makakapag cause ng pag-leave nila sa work. So another importance of industrial hygiene is that it aims to reduce or remove work hazard exposure by implementing a series of controls and programs towards keeping the workplace clean, free from environmental stressors or hygienic. So it we could say na cleanliness equates to the healthiness of workers and as well as the industry itself. So yun yung mga importance of industrial hygiene.
Moving on, meron tayong 5 types of hygiene hazards in the workplace, namely the environmental hazards, which are the kung saan yung conditions or substances that endanger an employee. Ito yung mga gas, contaminants, and particles na pwede nating ma-inhale. Then next is the chemical hazards, which involves potential harm from different forms of chemicals na nag-emphasize na industrial hygiene principles like yung pag-wear ng PPE, like yung mga sa laboratories, kailangan natin mag-wear ng lab gowns, protective gloves, and yung also yung protection natin sa eye. Then physical hazards, which is common like heat, yung na-experience natin ngayon, and yung noise, radiation, vibration, and increased chances of physical discomfort. Then next is the biological hazards. Ito yung exposure sa bacteria, viruses, and parasites na prevalent siya sa mga healthcare industries like hospitals, ganun. Then, ergonomic hazards. Ito yung mga nagkakos ng physical strain like dahil sa poor equipment, repetitive tasks, and pwede siya magkalid sa other illnesses. Next slide, please. Then, here are the occupational illnesses na pwede makuha from those hazards. Occupational illnesses are health conditions or disorders that caused by the work environment or related activities. First of all, the skin diseases. Ito yung if we are exposed to irritants like allergens and hazardous substances, then respiratory illnesses like yung pag-inhale natin ng mga harmful particles and gases or fumes na pathogens, and ito yung mga present din to sa work environment. Then musculoskeletal disorder or the MSDs, ito yun yung ergonomic hazard, yung repetitive motions and heavy lifting na pwede magkaroon ng strain or injury sa muscles. Then yung hearing loss, part to ng physical hazard, yung pagkakadevelop ng prolonged exposure to loud noises or machinery in the workplace. An example would be sa mga airports, yung pagte-take off and land off ng mga aircrafts. Next slide. Then we have cancer. Like, ito yung common to sa mga health, 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 like mga hospitals. Yung exposure natin sa carcinogens. Yung mga, example nito yung mga rad techs, exposed sila sa radiation, so prone sila dito. Then yung stress and mental health disorders. Like, ito yung from high pressure work environments like bullying, harassment, or traumatic experience at work. Then, pag-isahin ko na yung infectious diseases and poisoning. Ito yun nga, katulad nung sa respiratory illnesses, yung inadequate hygiene sa workplace natin. Pwede tayo magkaroon ng close contact with infected individuals and exposure to pathogens. Like, same din to sa poisoning, yung pagkain natin ng mga foods and inhalation nga, yung mga sa environment pa lang natin, makukuha natin yung mga sakit and sa also yung chemicals and present sa workplace. And yun lang.
So, ang next naman is the 5 principles of industrial hygiene. The 5 principles of industrial hygiene is used to prevent injury and illnesses, especially yung na-discuss kanina, which are the occupational illnesses. So there are 5 of them: the anticipation of health hazards, recognition of health hazards, evaluation of exposure to health hazards, control over worker exposure to health hazards, and confirmation of control measures. First is the anticipation of health hazards. This principle manages health hazards through prevention of identified dangerous events. It can be achieved with the conduction of surveys in the workplace. It is important to have continuous monitoring and evaluation to help identify and address health risks. The investigation of properties of hazardous chemicals is crucial to know what to prioritize. So, yun nga, importante na ma-anticipate and malaman yung mga future or present na health hazards na nangyayari sa workplace. And para malaman din kung ano yung action. Next is the recognition of health hazards. This highlights that recognition of health hazards is important to understand its underlying factors in the workplace. The requirement is to identify if work done by employees exposed to hazards or creates them. The recognition the safety of the workers can be protected while also mitigating risk. So recognition of health hazards after ng important para malaman if yung workers, habang nagtatrabaho sila ay exposed na sila sa hazard, or yung work na ginagawa nila ay gumagawa ng hazard for them. So, by recognizing yung mga factors na yun, pwedeng gumawa ng solusyon to protect them and to minimize yung mga risk. Next is evaluation of exposure to health hazards. An occupational exposure assessment is a way to assess the risk of workers being exposed to hazards in the workplace. So yung occupational exposure assessment or OEA is yung typically na ginagamit ng mga workplace. This is needed to make sure that exposure levels are safe for employees. It involves data collection through air sampling, personal monitoring, and biological monitoring. Industrial hygiene monitoring naman, this checks how much exposure a group of workers has to something harmful, either physical, biological, or chemical during their shift. So, dito malalaman if yung shift ng worker or yung ginagawa ng work is may harmful effects sa kanya, either physically, biologically, or chemically. Next is control over worker exposure to health hazards. Protecting workers from exposure to harmful substances is a key part of industrial hygiene. This means minimizing or eliminating worker contact with hazardous materials when the risk is dangerous. The hierarchy of controls is a used guide in this principle. Yung hierarchy of controls is iba't ibang ways to control worker exposure.
Example nun is yung PPE, which can help minimize or eliminate na yung worker exposure or contact sa dangerous chemicals and substances. Next is, and the final part, is confirmation of control measures. This step in industrial hygiene is making sure everything goes as planned. This checks if the safety measures put in place are protecting the workers. Keeping track of reports and data is also key to avoid workers from getting sick or hurt. So, it is mostly important na yung mga pinatupad na safety guidelines and safety protocols from the recognition and certification from the previous step ay gumagana and talagang nagpaprotect and nasa-safeguard yung mga workers from getting sick or.
So now let's move on to hazard communication and chemical safety. So to start off, let's try to define first what is hazard classification. So hazard classification is a process for analyzing and establishing the level of severity of the dangerous effects of a chemical substance. So once na natapos na yung process of hazard classification, ma-identify na natin kung ano yung hazard class and category ng chemical na tinetest natin. Masabi natin dito kung yung chemical substance na yun is flammable liquid ba siya, corrosive ba siya, and such. So, now, paano nga ba natin ginagawa yung hazard classification? So, provided sa hazard communication standard, ang hazard classification process consists of several steps. So, first is, of course, identifying the chemical. Of course, before tayo mag-test ng chemical substance, kailangan natin alamin muna kung ano nga ba yung product na gagamitin natin and yung purpose of the product. Second is identifying the relevant data regarding the hazards of a chemical. Of course, so during testing, it's important to get some data during our observation. Next step is reviewing the relevant data to ascertain the hazards associated with the chemical. And then after that, determining whether the chemical will be classified as hazardous according to the definition of hazardous chemical in the standard. And lastly, determining the degree of the hazard were appropriate by comparing the data with the criteria for health and physical hazards. So, ngayon, who must conduct hazard classification? So, the only parties mandated to determine the hazard associated with the chemicals they produce or imports are the producers and importers only. It is also noteworthy that employer na nagmamanufacture, nagpo-process, formulates, blends, mixes, repackages, or otherwise changes the composition of a hazardous chemical is considered only as a chemical manufacturer. So, distributors and employers may conduct hazard classifications if they're unsure about the safety information for the chemical they use or distribute.
Okay, so good day. I'm Ravi Erhas. Since we already discussed the definition of hazard communication, as well as the people that are involved in classifying these hazards, we'll be now digging to what are the resources needed to conduct a hazard classification. Okay, we have here three essential elements or the three primary resources that are required for hazard classification. First is the complete, accurate, most up-to-date literature and data concerning the hazardous chemical in question. We need an updated data for classifying hazards. Second is the ability to properly understand and interpret the information retrieved to identify and document hazards. So we need to fully understand what are the information and we need to interpret it properly for us to document and identify the hazards. Lastly is the specific criteria for each health and physical hazard class and category are defined in the hazard communication standard. So we have here the hazard communication standard. So what is the hazard communication standard? This is the HCS and the purpose of this is to ensure that the hazards of all chemical produced or imported are classified So take note that classified, and that the information on the hazardous chemicals is transmitted to employers and workers. So these standards only covers hazardous chemicals. So um, nothing more than that. During this classification process, the chemical manufacturer or importer must determine if the chemical being evaluated is hazardous or not. So on the third essential elements is we will be identifying if those chemicals written on our HCS is hazardous or not. Next is the chemical safety. Okay. So we have here the definition of chemical safety according to HCS or the Hazard Communication Standard, just like I mentioned a while ago. This is the chemical or any substance or a mixture of substance making any product a chemical. So any product that contains chemical, the substance or the mixtures of those substance is what we call chemical. Next is quick history. The Globally Harmonized System or the GHS developed in the UN's Agenda 21 in 1992. So the UN agenda is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development or UNCED held in Brazil, so 1992. It is an international standard for classifying chemicals and communicating their hazards. It became the basis for establishing comprehensive national chemical safety programs and a comprehensive approach to defining and classifying hazards and communicating information on labels and data and safety data sheets. So we have a synchronized or only one standard which is from the UN agenda. This is based on a globally harmonized system. Next is the chemical safety. We have here the OSHA or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration adopted this new hazardous chemical labeling requirement. So we have now the labeling requirements emphasizing quick visual cues on labels to alert users about hazards and provide handling instructions for safety. So the revised standards requires the information about chemical hazards be conveyed on labels using quick visual notation to alert the user, providing immediate recognition of the hazards. So labels must also provide instructions on how to handle the chemical so that the chemical users are informed about how to protect themselves. The label provides information to the workers on the specific hazardous chemical. While labels offer essential information for anyone who handles, uses, stores, and transports hazardous chemicals, they are limited by design in the amount of information they can provide. So when we see a product, we must see a visual cues regarding the hazards it contains or the chemical it contains so that we are aware on how we can handle those hazardous chemical if we experience something. Next is the physical hazards of chemicals. We have here two, which is the involved flammability and reactivity. So flammability refers to a chemical's propensity to burn with key indicators, including flash point, auto ignition, temperature, and flammable limits provided in safety data sheets. So this is the ability of a chemical to burn. Lastly is the reactivity, which concerns the likelihood of a substance to explode or reacting violently with air, water, and other substance upon contact, detailed in the stability and reactivity data sections of the SDS. So compared to flammability, the reactivity is on explosion and reaction on certain um, substances or chemicals such as air, water upon contact. So the next topic will be discussed by my group mates.
So we are now on the health hazards of chemicals. Actual health risk depends on both toxicity and exposure. Risk is minimal unless the chemical enters the body. Assessment of toxicity and routes of exposure helps determine necessary protective measures. Okay, so Chemicals can be harmful sa health nating mga humans as well as to the other living organisms like the animals. But ngayon, mag-focus tayo sa health hazards nito sa ating mga tao. We should know that the risk actually depends kung gaano ka-toxic yung chemical or substance na yun and kung gaano ka katagal na exposed rito. In fact, kahit yung mga highly toxic substances ay maaaring minimal lang yung risk kapag limited or maikli lang yung exposure mo rito. Also, the risk is actually low din if the chemical doesn't get into your body. Knowing how toxic a chemical is and knowing how you might be exposed to it enables you to know what protective measures are needed para maprotektahan mo yung sarili mo against these chemicals. So, toxicity versus hazard. Toxicity refers to substance ability to cause harm, while hazard indicates the likelihood of harm under conditions of use. Proper handling can mitigate risks even with highly toxic chemicals, while improper handling can mitigate risks evenly with highly toxic chemicals, while improper handling can make less toxic chemicals highly hazardous. So, toxicity basically talks about how much harm a substance can cause or yung ability ng isang substance para mag-cause ng harm sa isang living organism. While yung mga hazard naman yung tumutukoy sa mga potential for harm sa mga certain conditions of use or exposure. Para mas madaling intindihin, for example, yung mga highly toxic substance, maaaring hindi siya mag-cause ng significant hazard kapag na-contain ito or na-handle ito properly. On the other hand, yung mga less toxic chemicals naman, pwede siyang maging highly hazardous kapag na-mishandle ito ng tao. And it can actually very hazardous or dangerous. So for the next one, acute toxicity versus chronic toxicity. Acute toxicity refers to single, short exposure, effects rapid and typically reversible, while the chronic toxicity stems from prolonged, repeated exposure with effects manifesting gradually and potentially irreversible. So may two types ng toxicity, acute toxicity and chronic toxicity. So anong difference nila? So basically, acute toxicity siya kapag na-expose ka sa isang chemical for a short period of time lamang. So, yung effects nito maaaring mangyari quickly pero usually reversible naman siya or nababalik pa rin sa normal yung mga naging epekto nito sa'yo. However, yung chronic toxicity naman, ito naman yung kapag na-expose ka sa chemical na yon repeatedly for a long period of time. And usually, yung effects niya ay matagal bago mag-appear or mahalata. And kadalasan yung mga effects nito ay permanent na talaga. So, routes of entry. Ito masyadong self-explanatory naman so hindi ko na siya masyadong i-expound pa. So, ito yung mga ways para mag-enter sa'yo yung mga chemicals. So, maaring through skin and eye contact, which is direct contact sa skin or eyes mo, inhalation or kapag nalanghap mo yung chemicals. Third one is ingestion. Ito naman yung kapag accidentally mong nakain yung isang bagay na nagko-contain ng harmful chemicals and pwede ring yung last is through injection. So next is the label elements. So these label elements are actually required by the HCS or the Hazard Communication Standard for all to follow. This contain yung mga elements on labels sa mga hazardous chemicals. So ito yung iba't ibang label elements. First one is yung name, address, and telephone number of the chemical manufacturer, importer, or another responsible party. So basically, ito yung mga manufacturer's information ng isang product na nagko-contain ng certain chemicals. So next one is the product identifier. Identifies the hazardous chemical. So product identifier is actually how the hazardous chemical is identified. It includes the chemical name, code number, or batch number, but it is not limited to what have been mentioned here. Also, the manufacturer, importer, or distributor is the one who can decide kung ano yung appropriate product identifier na ilalagay nila. So, signal words indicates the relative level of severity of the hazards and alerts the reader to a potential hazard on the label. So, two words are used as signal words. So, first one is the danger and the second one is the warning. So, ginagamit yung danger para sa mga more severe hazards while ginagamit naman yung warning na signal word kapag less naman yung severity ng hazard. Yun pala, wait lang. Dito sa signal words, take note lang din na um, iisa lang yung gagamitin mong signal word dapat. Kahit na marami pang hazard yung na-impose or maaaring ma-post ng isang certain chemical or substance na yon, iisa lang dapat yung signal word na gagamitin mo. For example, kapag isa sa mga hazard sa chemical na yon is severe, so danger dapat yung gamitin mo. Kapag naman yung another hazard pa doon is less severe naman, so dapat warning lang. Ngayon, since sinabi nga dito na iisa lang dapat yung signal word na gagamitin mo, so pipiliin mo yung word na danger. So, yung danger lang yung ilalagay mo sa label na yon since ayun yung pinaka-severe na hazard sa chemical na yon. Okay. So, the fourth is the hazard statements. Describe the nature and degree of the chemical's hazards. For example, causes damage to the kidneys through prolonged or repeated exposure when absorbed through skin. So, dito pala sa hazard statement, dapat lahat ng applicable hazard statements ay nakikita sa label. Also, pwede mo rin i-combine yung mga hazard statements na medyo related naman para maiwasan yung redundancies and it should be specific din para mas mabilis maintindihan ng mga makakabasa nito. Fifth one is the precautionary statements. These are the ones that describe recommended measures that should be taken para ma-minimize or ma-prevent natin yung mga adverse effects ng chemicals kapag na-expose tayo sa hazardous chemicals. So there are four types of precautionary statements. First one is prevention, then response, storage, and the disposal. So the sixth is the pictograms. So the pictograms are actually referring to the graphic symbols communicating specific hazard information. Malaking role yung ginagampanan nitong pictogram sa label kasi ito yung pinaka nakaka-catch ng attention ng mga makakakita nito. For a little background lang din, as of June 1, 2015, the OSHA or the Occupational Safety and Health Administration mandated the use of GHS pictograms on labels in order to inform the consumers about potential chemical dangers. So yun. Take note din pala na may required na format ang pictograms. So meron siyang red square frame set at a point with a black hazard symbol on a white background. Sufficiently wide to be visible on hazard chemicals being shipped or transported from a manufacturer, importer, or distributor. So ayan yung examples ng pictograms na minandate na gamitin ng mga manufacturers. So sample labels. So, sample labels demonstrate how a manufacturer or importer may display the appropriate information on the label. So, these sample labels serves as a visual representation demonstrating how a manufacturer or importer can effectively display necessary information on a product label. So, ito yung example. So, we can see here that the substance is HS85 batch number 85L6543. So, sa paggawa nito, step 1, we should perform classification. So, dito sa example nito, sa example substance natin, ang class niya is acute oral toxicity category 4. Then, for the step 2 naman, we should gather the labeling information. So, makikita nyo yung pictograms. Ayan, yung kaninang pang 6 na label element natin. Ayan. So, makikita nyo dito, ang signal word natin is warning. So, that means less severe yung hazards niya. Then hazard statements, harmful if swallowed. Then indicated din dito ang precautionary statements niya. Ayan, hindi ko na babasahin kasi masyadong marami. Then, ayan. Step 3, create the label. So then, ayun, magagawa mo na yung label mo kapag pinagsama-sama mo na lahat ng mga label elements mo na naaral natin kanina. And ito na nga yung finished example ng label niya. So you can see here sa baba yung name, address, and telephone number ng manufacturer or yung manufacturer's information. You can see here then yung product identifier dito sa taas. Then, yung signal words niya, which is yung warning, meaning less severe. And yung hazard statements and the precautionary statements andito sa baba ng signal words. And yung pictogram nga, ayan, yung pinaka nakaka-catch ng attention natin. And yeah, that is all. So ito po yung references na nagamit namin. That is all po. Thank you.